Shall we start, sir?
Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I heartily welcome all of you once again in the Langlit online lecture series, day 9. At the outset, we, the team of Langlit, need to thank all the participants who have joined with us by logging Zoom application regularly and those who are watching, enjoying, and learning with us live on Facebook and YouTube channel Langlit's Educators. Thank you very much for your love and words of appreciations, blessings, and academic support. We have been receiving overwhelming response from all over India and abroad. Nationally and internationally acclaimed academicians are going to deliver their talks on various aspects of language and literature on the forthcoming days. In addition to that, it's not the end of the lecture series. It's just beginning. We will arrange such lecture series every now and then. We will try our best to invite well-known academicians during this lockdown period. We are giving unique, there are certain instructions for the participants. I am getting so many messages on Facebook or through WhatsApp.
Good morning to all of you. I hope I am audible to you all. Am I audible to you all? Okay, thank you. So I welcome you all to this lecture. In the very beginning, I would like to thank the organizers for holding this kind of a lecture series through Zoom meeting app. We all have been undergoing the repressive lockdown for more than a month, and it has really become almost unbearable for all of us to be stationed at home, and then none of us really is able to concentrate any work as such. So under such hard times, I'm really happy that uh, the organizers have come up with this novel idea of holding lectures and uh, somehow making us active in a certain sense. I'm going to speak on something which really has been a very significant issue, but rather highly neglected for many reasons by the academicians. We have the
Sir,
colonial past. Yeah, Am I audible? Am I audible to you all?
uh, what was the problem, sir?
Am I not audible?
Yes, yes, you are audible, sir.
I already started.
Okay. I think,
Yeah, I
okay.
think I am audible. Yeah,
Yes,
everybody is saying yes. Yeah,
okay, yes.
Prashant, you need to set your
Yes, yes, okay.
tune to.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
No problem, sir. Go ahead.
yeah. We'll start. Yeah. Um, we all know that language is so vital to all of us, but despite our realization of the vitality of language, we, the teachers of English or any other language, are somehow made to teach literature more than really giving due respect and time to language teaching or language learning for some reasons, particularly
Sir,
in the
you
colonial
need to
time.
switch off your fan.
And yeah,
Okay, thank you.
yeah, yeah. Gauri Vishwanathan has already informed us about how the colonial masters were interested in making us, learn literature more, and the entire teaching of humanities somehow remained literature centric for over a century. And even after independence, we continued to remain obsessed with literature as such. So languages really had to suffer a lot. We hardly have linguistics departments in the universities. We hardly have teachers who are officially trained in linguistics or social linguistics in the departments of English in the universities or at the colleges. So this has really made us somehow lopsided, and I always have a feeling that we all should always have equal number of language teachers in the departments, but I never came across any department having a good number of, say, teachers trained in linguistics or social linguistics or so. So I deliberately chose to speak on a topic which perhaps is highly otherwise provocative, and hope that at the end of this lecture you start thinking along certain different lines. I'll start with two scholars who started a debate almost 3 decades ago. One is Robert Phillipson, who came out with a book, Linguistic Imperialism, in 1992, published by Oxford University Press. And along with this book came another book called Linguistic Genocide in Education. So it's a long title. The part is Linguistic Genocide. This was written by Tos Kutnap Kangas, who otherwise was a co-author with Robert Phillipson occasionally. So both of them have been trying to raise this issue by writing books, articles, and they are also involved in some kind of activism. So my job here is to make you understand what this linguistic genocide is and how this entire discourse is relevant to a nation like India, which is a multilingual kind of a society that we all know. So I'll start with my slides. Hope that I can share my slides with you.
Kindly go to the folder section, sir.
Yeah, which one?
Down.
Files.
Sir, go to your folder
Sorry, yeah.
section.
Folder.
Folder, yes. Or desktop, where you have kept it.
Yeah. I start with new share, right?
Yes, yes. Have you sent your slide to me by email?
No, I didn't.
Okay, okay.
I failed to do that. Yeah, got it.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I think now it is visible.
Wait.
Yeah, is this slide visible to you?
Not yet, sir. Wait a minute.
You have to do something from that side, I think.
No, not from my side, sir. There is an option to share. You need to press that button when the slide is open. So click on the slide.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not yet, sir.
Really?
No. Sir, can you share the slide to me by email?
Oh, how do you
Immediately,
do that?
You have the email, your email ID is open besides your Zoom application.
Really?
Yes. Okay, stop sharing first and then restart. Stop sharing the slide
Okay. Hmm. Okay. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
and then try once again. Wait a minute, sir. Yes,
Got?
yes. So,
You got the
yes,
slide?
yes, yes. If we want to pursue
Yeah.
something,
Yeah. Yeah.
yes. Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. How do I move to the next slide?
Uh, you
By
can use
using.
your keyboard or click by clicking.
Oh. Oh. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Oh.
Yes. Now we can move ahead, sir. No problem.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Prashant. Thank you. Yeah. Do you see the first slide here? The title?
Yes, yes. Very
Yeah.
much.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for the disturbance. Yeah. We'll continue now.
Yes.
Yeah. Uh, uh, yeah. It is no need to. I mean, speak about how India is a multilingual society, but there are several problems with our own being multilingual for many reasons. Sometimes we find under the colorful rubric of multilinguality or multiculturalism, sometimes this very idea of multilinguality becomes a matter of celebration, and we come across hundreds of books which celebrate this idea of India being multilingual. So we have around 400 odd languages and 3,000 plus dialects. And despite having such a rich heritage of languages or so, India has not really been successful in planning its own languages. So we, on the count of say language planning, are an utter failure. Secondly, we really fail to define the idea of language. If you look at other scholars, you find that many of the scholars have already admitted how it is difficult to define languages. If you really try to gather some statistics from across the world, you'll come to know that we do not have any reliable statistics about the number of languages used in the world. Even Tos Kutnop Kangas has spent a considerable part of her book in dealing with how this kind of failure is a serious issue when it comes to, say, preservation or conservation or enrichment of several languages which are already endangered ones. So she has written in a book that we can count pigs, but we cannot count languages. So why do we fail in, say, counting languages? Why do we fail to, say, measure or map the world linguistically? So the, understanding language itself is not so easy when it comes to, say, planning a certain nation, or we can say thinking of a certain speech community or so. How do we differentiate, say, between language and dialect is another issue that we will come to it soon. But before that, let me just briefly make you realize that this idea of multilingual is an outcome of a very complex social structure that India has been having for over 2000 plus years. And this structure, by this structure, I mean the structure which was based on initially the Varna order and then by the caste order. So this exploitative hierarchical structure of the Indian society somehow gave rise to different caste dialects and different languages, and really this kind of, say, development of several languages across the nation has a very complex history. If you try to look at the scholarship developed by some of the American and European scholars, particularly the ones who were doing in the field of anthropology and history and linguistics together, will come to know how difficult it was for the scholars to look at the, or we can say study the political history of languages in India, which has not yet been properly written. Let me bring your attention to a very significant scholar, Robert D. King, who wrote a book on the language conflict in the 20th century in the context of Nehruvian politics. He also pointed out how it was difficult for the scholars to understand political history of these languages. He tried to establish the need of writing political history of languages in India, which will take into consideration caste, gender, patriarchy, and class, race, religion, and the entire power structure that comes of such complex social structure as such. So this kind of say perspective on Indian linguistics, we can say, or Indian linguistic scenario calls for a very sophisticated and politically, we can say, charged kind of a point of view, which will look at the interrelationship between language and power. On the one hand, language and ideology, and language and say the social structure on the other. So this is going to be a very complex exercise, but most needed one. And this will give us understand how the traditional linguistics and even the applied linguistics and social linguistics also really do not help much in understanding the complexity involved in the language scenario. So we need to understand the limitations of social linguistics. Social linguistics does help us understand the interrelationship between, say, language and society, where several social factors simply remain variables and help us understand how language essentially is a phenomenon which keeps on changing. So something that occupies centrality of social linguistics. But we need a more sophisticated and more nuanced, more informed kind of a perspective, which will help us move beyond looking at the simplistic understanding of language and society, where language and society are assumed to be two different entities having some kind of relationship between the two. So we need to go beyond that, and we need to look at how any social structure is essentially a fractured kind of a stratified one, and how power emerges of this kind of structure and shapes the linguistic scenario in a given society. So some of the scholars are trying to theorize what now is called as politico linguistics. So this requires a journey from social linguistics, and we need to move to an altogether new domain which has not been properly explored as yet, but there is a need that some kind of serious work be undertaken in the field of political linguistics, where we will try to look at the language scenario from a political point of view. So discourse on language these days essentially is a political discourse, and Foucault has already taught us how to look at every phenomenon essentially as a political phenomenon. So we cannot have a perspective which is so naive, or we can say so innocently developed. So this kind of a perspective will help us understand how we need to say address the problems, the issues which were otherwise not so seriously or adequately dealt with in the field of social linguistics or applied linguistics, or if you allow me to go back to the traditional linguistics, which had really developed no tools which could be used for addressing many issues which really require our urgent attention, such as linguistic genocide. So I'll come to it a little later. Now, I'll start with again Toos Kutnop-Kangas. She, as I told you, came out with a book more than 2 decades ago. The book is entitled as, it's a bulky book, but makes fascinating reading, Linguistic Genocide in Education, where she tries to survey the language scenario of the world, and is trying to say address a question which she calls, and even otherwise the question was already raised before she started writing on started thinking on writing this book. The question of genocide. I hope all of you know the term genocide. Genocide refers to a kind of say mass killing, kind of say lynching of a particular group. And when a particular group is particularly some sort of say an ethnic or religious minority, this kind of lynching becomes a political act undertaken by those who are in power, those who are dominant, and this kind of an act calls for some kind of serious attention. So the UNO came out with its first resolution on genocide some 70 years ago, and some 70 years ago also the UNO had to take note of how the languages of the world had already been threatened by certain dominant languages or by some certain kind of say political reasons. So here begins her book with the idea of linguistic diversity. So she talks about how there are thousands of languages used in the world, and how such a large number of languages used in the world really made the world beautiful and so meaningful. So did we really succeed in maintaining this kind of multilinguality or this kind of multiplicity in the domain of language? This is something which arrested the attention of the author, and she took to writing this book. So the first question that she begins is, what do you mean by language? I mean, she has no answer to this question, and I think none of us really has any satisfactory answer. But we need to keep thinking on the phenomenon called language. So how do we define language, for example? So this is something which she begins with. And associated with this question is another question, and that is how many languages are used in the world? So again, there is no, as I started with issue, there is no authentic figure, no authentic data available to us as to how many languages are used in the world for many reasons. And she has discussed several reasons in this book. One of them is how do we differentiate between language and dialect. So this is something which has been very well commented upon by several scholars. We have now a rich debate, rich scholarship available on the idea of dialect. There is a new domain called dialectology. We have very renowned scholars such as Charles Ferguson and William Lebau and Peter Trudgill and a few more who spent several decades on studying the idea of dialect. So this is something which is a significant question when it comes to language, or when it comes to understanding how many languages are used in a particular nation or in the world as such. There are no particular criteria which can really help us understand the difference between language and dialect, but we all know that certain dialects of a given say language, in the course of standardization or culturalization, becomes dominant, and it emerges as a language, as a legitimized, we can say officially patronized kind of a thing. And then that particular variety emerges as a dominant variety and acquires the status of language, and all other varieties of the same language are relegated to the status of dialects, and they suffer a lot. They really do not receive any political patronage or any kind of say financial assistance either by the state or the non-state agencies, and they have to suffer a lot. Let me quickly bring your attention to the Constitution of India, which has the which has a statement made. I mean, the Constitution has made a statement on say the linguistic scenario. We have linguistic minorities mentioned in the Constitution, and in the 8th schedule there is a list of languages given by the makers of the Constitution. Initially there were 15 languages, now we have 22 languages. So we are living in a nation having hundreds of languages, out of which only 22 have been recognized by the Constitution as the languages which are eligible for official, political, or financial help or assistance. So India makes a peculiar case so far as multilinguality is concerned, and so far as the rate of loss of languages also is concerned. I mean, this has been very well marked by the UNO and Tos Kutnapkangas in a book, and many other scholars like Ajit Kumar Mohanty has come out with several books on this issue. We have Ganesh Devi of the recent times, dealing with all such issues. So, so far as language death is concerned, India makes a peculiar case, and this really has made many of us think of this kind of a question. Any kind of, say, debate on language scenario in the last 2 to 3 centuries makes us think of globalization, of course. So globalization becomes our immediate context, our immediate, we can say, past, and we need to understand how this kind of a process, which essentially is taken as economic, also impacts the linguistic scenario in a given society. Very quickly, I will refer to 2 terms without really wasting my time on defining and explaining these terms. I hope many of us have already read a lot on these ideas. One is imperialism and the other one is globalization. Sometimes these terms are used interchangeably. There is no harm as such in using these terms interchangeably, but there are scholars who really differentiate the 2 ideas, and we also need to understand how globalization is a stage in the long, say, history of imperialist politics in the world. So how globalization has changed the circumstances under which we live, and also the circumstances in which many languages are placed in India and in some other nations such as Indonesia, which is a significant site of, say, language loss, we can say. So there are nations such as India which have really suffered a lot in the last 30 years, which were marked by a certain kind of, say, international politics called as globalization. So there are scholars, particularly economists and political analysts, who look at globalization as essentially economic or political issue. And we really fail to understand, to look at globalization is, as a cultural kind of a process or a cultural kind of a phenomenon. So how globalization is going to have its impact on the cultural issues, or say the language as such, or how it has already had its very powerful impact on culture or language as such. So this is something which again has not yet been properly mapped. If you really look at the language scenario in India, and if you really try to know as to how this scenario has been influenced by the politics of globalization, we hardly have any authentic data, or we hardly have any kind of, say, reliable analysis available to us. So when it comes to the state census data as such, even that also has not been so reliable. If you look at the data which has been made available to us in the last 30 or 40 years, we find that every census has its own data about the number of languages used in India. So this kind of negligence that the linguistic scenario, I mean language scenario in India has suffered over the last 30 or 40 or 60 years is something which is really very much annoying and depressing. However, now we have very sophisticated studies undertaken by, say, Robert Philipson and Tos Kutnapkangas, who came out with a notion of linguistic imperialism. So there are scholars who have already challenged this notion, and there is a lot of debate available on the idea of linguistic imperialism when it was first theorized by Robert Philipson some 30 plus years ago. I mean, whether imperialism is essentially economic or it could also be cultural or linguistic, this is one issue which was raised by some of the orthodox Marxian scholars. But there were some other scholars also who refused to call this phenomenon something that Toe and Robert have called linguistic genocide. So these scholars seem to be reluctant in using the term linguistic genocide for this. Then what do we call them? So perhaps one way of looking at it is to call it as language death. The other perhaps would be calling it killing of languages or loss of languages. And perhaps the more politicized, we can say, understanding would be calling it genocide. So whether to call it language death or say linguistic genocide is something which has been debated. We have scholars such as David Crystal, who has a book entitled as Language Death, and we have scholars such as Robert Philipson, who calls it linguistic imperialism. So of course, we need to understand why these scholars have their own positions on this kind of an issue. And Robert Philipson and Toe Skutnov-Kangas have already pointed out the limitations of the term language death. So they view that since languages do not die, natural deaths, this phenomenon cannot be called as language death. There are reasons which are responsible for the loss of languages. There are certain languages which are dying, and you can predict as to what languages are going to die, what languages are going to suffer. And there are some mathematicians who have already contributed to understand the rate of loss of languages. I mean, how many languages are going to be there at the end of this century. For example, Toe has quoted a mathematician who has informed us long ago that at the end of the 21st century, we will have only half of the languages that we are now having now. So this is something which calls for a kind of say understanding as to how languages are dying in a great number. And if they are dying in a great number, if the rate of loss of languages is much higher than what it was a century ago or say a couple of centuries ago, then we need to understand as to what really made this happen. When it comes to the position taken by Toe Skutnov-Kangas and Robert Philipson, we do understand that this idea of multilinguality is in danger all over the world. We will come down to the case of India first, and then again we'll go back to the international scenario and understand how this makes a peculiar case. India, we all know, is I mean, a multilingual nation. We are having 1,652 mother tongues, which have been classified into 300 to 400 languages. Again, no exact number available to us. There are many other figures also put forth by many other scholars. Out of this around 300 languages, 22 have been recognized officially by the Constitution of India. And this data is slightly older. This was around say 2009 or so. So 104 languages were used for radio or broadcasting for about say I mean by different radio stations in India. These scholars have already talked about the role that certain dominant languages are playing in the loss of languages across the world. And of course, the focus here is on English, because England really dominated the world through colonization for more than say 2 centuries or so. Major part of say the world was dominated by the British colonizers, and they tried their best to say impose, we can say, English on the colonies. So how English emerges as a threat to different minority languages or different, say, linguistic minorities across the world. This is something which Robert Philipson and Tou Kutnov Kangas have been trying to argue for. And this is something that has already been debated by some of the scholars such as Hans Raj Dua, a neglected name in the debate on, say, language politics in India, who came out with a book called Hegemony of English more than 2 decades ago. Again, a very neglected book. We have scholars such as Hans Raj Dua of the slightly older generation, and Ajit Kumar Mohanty, who was a professor at JNU. So these scholars, tried to argue for, say, the dominance of English, how the dominance of English is largely responsible for this kind of, say, loss of languages in many different ways in India. So if you quickly look at the some of the surveys which were undertaken in India, the survey which is available to us is the 6th All India Educational Survey, in which we come to know that 41 languages were used in schools in the year 1999, again 20 years ago, as against 67 in 1976 and 81 in 1970. So if you look at, say, the number of languages used in the school, we find that there is a progressive loss, progressive decay in the number of, say, languages used in the school as medium of education. So from 81, we came down to 67, and from 67 to 41, and now must be less than that. So the actual languages in the schools at various levels is coming down. In the year 1990, 43 languages were used at primary level as against 33 in 1999. So 25 languages were used at upper primary level in 1999 as against 31 in 1990. At secondary level, 21 languages were used in 1999 as against 22 in the year 1990. Again, at higher secondary level, 18, and it was 20. And if you come to, say, the university level, we find that it is almost exclusively English now, which is dominating the scenario when it comes to university education as such. So who are the communities who are suffering so far as language death is concerned or linguistic genocide is concerned? Of course, the ones who are culturally or socially less powerful. For example, when it comes to India, we know that we have a huge population, section of our population as tribal society, tribal section. There are two kinds of tribe. All those tribes living in the forest called as scheduled tribes, and there are certain tribes which have been roaming all around the country. They are called as nomads, nomadic tribes. So if put together, the scheduled tribes and the nomadic tribes make around 25 crore, so 250 million, which again makes 1/5 of the Indian population, or more than 1/5 of the Indian population. So such a huge section of the Indian society is called as tribal, nomadic, or scheduled, primarily because they have their own languages, apart from other, say, criteria used for recognizing a certain society as a tribal society. Language makes a significant criterion, and the tribals have their own languages, and some of the tribals are really very huge in terms of, say, demography. So out of the entire tribal children, scheduled and nomadic, we can say that it is 1%, and now less than 1% of the tribal children getting education in their own mother tongue. So this is something which does matter when it comes to linguistic, say, imperialism or linguistic genocide. Primarily because the UNESCO came out with a proposition that all the languages, almost all the languages, except for a very few languages in the world, are under threat. To has already discussed how 97% of the European languages are endangered languages. So Europe makes a very bad case of, say, linguistic genocide, where all the languages of the linguistic minorities, tribes, and migrants have been threatened, and only a few languages, which are the dominant languages such as English, German, French, and Italian, so they somehow could manage to survive. Of course, English is bound to be there, but there are so many other minority languages which are dying fast. There is a book called Minority Languages in Europe, and many of us really do not know that there are minority languages in Europe. There are groups in Europe, in America. There were groups in Australia, which makes a very bad case of, say, linguistic genocide during the colonial times. So it was even in Europe that many of these languages have begun to face the heat of globalization, and they have already been announced by the UNESCO as endangered languages. So one of the criteria suggested by the UNESCO to recognize whether a language is an endangered language is not is about medium of education. So the UNESCO has said that if 30% of the children of a given speech community are getting education in the language other than their mother tongue, their language is liable to be called as an endangered language. So if you look at a dominant language such as Marathi, for example, uh, uh, which is one of the largest, say, languages so far as the number of users of language are concerned in the world. So Marathi also makes a peculiar case where more than, say, 15% of the Marathi speaking children are receiving education through English now in Maharashtra. So this data is available to us, and this data is quite reliable because the data comes from the schools, and we can trust. So if 30% of the children of a particular speech community are getting education through the language other than their mother tongue, that language can be or should be called as an endangered language. So all the tribal languages in India have become endangered languages, and all the minority languages except for Hindi, Bangla, Kannada, Telugu, Tamil, Marathi, perhaps, and Malayalam, and a few more, Urdu. All other languages except for these few languages can be called as endangered languages if you, say, apply this criterion to these languages. So this mismatch between school language and home language really is bound to have a very adverse impact on, say, uh, the way children receive education and the way children are brought up in any given society. So Toes, Kutnop, Kangas, and many others now are talking about the children's right to education through their mother tongue. So this is something which again has suffered a great amount of negligence so far as language planning is concerned. We know that there is a huge gap between the policy on minority languages in a given society and the official policy, say, on the languages in general in the same society. For example, when it comes to India, there is a commission meant for the minority languages in India. If you read the annual reports published by these commissions, you'll come to know how the state seems to be, trying to project itself as a kind of a caring agency so far as these languages are concerned. But on the other hand, we find the overall general policy on education framed by the state lacks in any concern for the minority languages or the languages which have been already endangered. So this certainly makes us understand how English is treated, how English receives some kind of, say, patronage by the state, and how the emergence and dominance of English, say in case of India and many other erstwhile British colonies, and in some other cases French and German and perhaps some other languages such as Spanish. So such dominant languages, how these languages emerge as a threat. So how do we understand, say, uh, the relationship, say, between English and all other dominant languages in India, or minority or endangered languages in India? So this is something which has been very well commented upon by some of the scholars in the last few decades or so. There is a wonderful publishing house called Linguistic Matters, and this publishing house has come out with several books on multilingual matters, how multilinguality is under threat, and how English ultimately emerges as a language threatening the existence of virtually thousands of languages across the world. So Robert Philipson has very I mean closely discussed the politics involved in the spread of English, and how the British and American imperialist agencies such as the BBC and Ford Foundation. So these are just two significant imperialist agencies to name, how the agencies were officially involved in promoting English in the colonies, including India. Let me tell you very briefly that the university which we always have high regard for, that is the English and Foreign Languages University, earlier called as the CFAIL, and before that just CIE, that is the Central Institute of English. So it started with CIE and then became CFAIL and now IFLU. So progressively developed, and we can see how the development of IFLU also helps us understand the way Indian ruling class became aware of, say, initially English, then foreign languages, and how this institute then was converted into foreign language university. But let me tell you that in the first decade of the establishment of the CIE, this institute received huge, say, grant from Ford Foundation and the British Council, which otherwise were imperialist kind of, say, agencies. And these agencies were primarily interested in promoting English in India, and they made the CIE its base. So the rise and development of a certain language called English is not just a natural phenomenon. We need to understand how the state is actively involved in promoting English, and the same state we need to see how the state is involved in, say, the way languages have suffered negligence for quite a long time. So I'm not really speaking against English as such. I'm not saying that English should be demolished or English should be banished or so. I mean, that would be very much foolish to say so. But what I'm trying to argue for here is that there is a need for democratization of English language education. In the name of, say, English education, we find how private English medium schools have sprouted all over the nation. Even a small town, even a small village also has its own English medium school. So English continued to remain a matter of, say, private education, and you have to pay for something which Macaulay had already said in his 1835 minute, as to how there were people even before Macaulay drafted his minute, how there were certain groups, particularly caste groups in Bengal, in Maharashtra, who were submitting their petitions to the British for teaching English. So Macaulay made a very significant statement, which remained largely neglected. Macaulay said that there already was a demand for English, and what the British were doing was simply recognizing this demand. So what Benting, as the Governor General, and Macaulay as part of the committee, what they were doing was simply, addressing the demand which was already made by the elite in some parts of India, such as Bengal and Maharashtra, for example. So for quite a long time, that we see that there was some kind of, say, elitist section in the Indian society which had recognized the importance of English, and they somehow wanted to dominate English education. According to the last census, we come to know that it's a very small section of the Indian population which really can speak English or use English effectively. This figure is some around some, say, 10% or so. But Ajit Kumar Mohanty says, I mean, he's a professor at JNU. According to Mohanty, it is a very small section. He says that it is less than 3% of the Indian population who can really manage to, say, use English effectively. Let me conclude with what Kancha Ilaya experienced in South Africa when he went to South Africa more than a decade ago to participate in an international conference against racism. When he was in Johannesburg, he could see at small places, even in buses and at public places, every other person was able to speak English effectively. So he was so impressed by the scenario there and came back to India and wrote an essay, which is a significant essay so far as the state of English in India is concerned. And he tried to say as to how English was dominated by a minuscule, say, section of the Indian population, and how a large section of the Indian population was left to suffer. So English becomes kind of a site of, say, class conflict or class contestation in India. And on the one hand, we find English education, due to severe kind of privatization, became a prerogative of a small section of the Indian population. On the other hand, we find hundreds of languages of the common gentry, say various tribal groups and linguistic minorities, have been suffering, and virtually they are almost now going to die. So India makes a very peculiar case so far as language death or, say, linguistic genocide is concerned. And I feel that we need to have a more sophisticated, say, more refined perspective, which perhaps could be informed by the theories developed by Edward Said and his teacher Michel Foucault and Antonio Gramsci. So these are some of the scholars who can really help us understand how we can do best to save our languages or to enrich our languages and try to somehow maintain multilinguality. So I stop here and hope that there are questions, and hope some of you can come with your own views and comments. So thank you for making me speak on this topic, and hope that you enjoy it and you do respond and participate actively in the debate.
And there are a few questions. Hello. Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, I'm getting.
Yes, sir. There is one question by Dr. Kishore Ingre.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about the social inequalities between the speakers of English and the speakers of other languages?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I briefly commented upon this. I was trying to argue for how English became a sort of say field which remained dominated by a minuscule, section of the Indian population. There are two kinds of elite which have really used English for their own dominance. One type of elite was the older elite, which predominantly came from the Brahminical background. And in the course of globalization, we have a very new kind of elite, a very new kind of class, which has come from different sections of the Indian society. In the course of, say, last, say, 3 or 4 decades, we find a lot of homogenization has taken place, and a new elite has come up from across the community, from different social backgrounds, from different social sections. And this is the second, we can say, kind or category of the elite, which has come from the dominant peasant castes predominantly, which really is trying hard to spread private English education through towns and cities and the villages. So caste does matter. I mean, even in the colonial times, we find how the Brahminical classes dominated English. There are enough studies now on this. And in the contemporary context, we do not find a particular caste dominating English as such. But English is left to the market now, and almost the state has a policy that the market will take care of English. And this certainly will have a very adverse impact on all those sections who cannot afford to uh, pay a huge amount to buy English education. So this kind of privatization of English education is less inclusive, and this certainly will have adverse impact on a large section of the Indian population.
Okay, sir. There is another question. How does linguistic genocide affect culture?
Oh, yeah. See, if at all we have to save democracy all over the world, we need to learn to recognize and respect the idea of multiplicity. We need to believe that there are many ways of living, there are many ways of thinking, there are many ways of speaking or expressing our views. There are many ways of, say, wearing clothes or eating food or making food or so. What is quite remarkable about globalization is that globalization is seen as a great leveler. So we find a great amount of, say, this kind of variability is under threat, and this will have very adverse impact on our culture, on our life. Let me give you an example. A comparative study of Japanese and English was made by a scholar, and it was found that the Japanese language allows you to think of a certain phenomenon from different points of view. So this kind of, say, multiple points of view, I mean, this ability to think of a certain phenomenon from different points of view is something which is very much integral, something which is very much inherent to that language. So this is something that Japanese is losing. So in the study, it was found that under the influence of English as such, Japanese is losing this strength. And as English is overpowering, as English is dominating many of the, say, Eastern languages such as Hindi, Marathi, Tamil, and Japanese, and many other languages, these languages are losing a lot. And what they will lose, they will also lose some of the so-called non-linguistic features, such as Japanese allows you to think in many different ways. So this kind of, say, possibility is not going to be there. So if we are increasingly moving towards a kind of, say, linguistic homogenization, we will lose multicultural ethos, we will lose democracy, we will lose multiple ways of living, thinking, eating, and say, living. I mean, living in the world as such. So if democracy is to survive, we need to understand the idea of multiplicity. We need to understand the idea of multilinguality or multiculturality. I'm not saying that we need not learn English as such. We need to learn many languages. We need to have more universities of foreign languages. South Korea alone has more than 3 universities exclusively meant for education in foreign languages. Such a small nation, smaller than Maharashtra can have 3 universities. We have just one, that is IFLU, where the focus is on English, and then again there are a few small foreign language departments. So I'm not against, foreign language education or English education as such. But if at all we are learning English, we have to make sure that English doesn't emerge as a threat to many other smaller or endangered languages or minority languages as such. So this kind of multilinguality itself is going to help us understand the environmental, say, issues, cultural issues, religious issues as such, and that will make us more democratic as such. Any kind of homogenization will lead us to loss of, say, knowledge, loss of traditional, say, practices, loss of our indigenous wisdom, loss of, say, many practices which otherwise are much better than what we learned through colonization and imperialism. So we need to think of more inclusive policies and more democratic and egalitarian policies, which will make sure that languages do not suffer simply because of the dominance of a certain language.
Hello.
Yeah.
Are you there, sir? Doki, sir?
Yeah, I'm there.
Hello. Yes, sir. You can ask your question.
I have posted it already.
Yeah, I'm not able to read.
Yeah, sir can't be able to read, so you can ask your question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Sir, actually my question was, hello?
Yes, yes.
Yes, yes. Yes,
Sir, this is Nitin from Daran.
Yeah.
My question actually was, shall we say that LPLP, language planning and language policy, has also been politically biased? And our other question was, what is your take on this Hindu ideology and imposition of Hindi? That is what.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. This, language planning. The question was raised some 50 years ago by a scholar who wrote an essay, "Can Languages Be Planned?" And since then, the scholars have been trying to theorize the idea of language planning. So much before the scholars started talking about language planning, there already was some kind of politics involved in the way languages were planned. If you look at the history of colonial times, you find how the languages of India were systematically planned by the foreign rulers and the indigenous elite. So both were equally responsible for whatever language politics was going on during the colonial period. There is a lot of, say, official involvement in language planning, and since the state seems to be simply negligent of the rights of the minority groups, the rights of children, the rights of many tribal and other groups who have already suffered in the last few centuries, we can say that there is some kind of bias against a large section of the Indian population so far as language planning is concerned. Secondly, yeah, Hindi makes a peculiar case. Since we were ruled over by the European colonizers, we were made to follow the European institutions such as the parliament, parliamentary democracy, jurisprudence, and again, the idea of national language. If you look at the European nations, you'll find that many of these nations were formed along the linguistic lines, along the language lines. This is not the case with India. We never had a single language as a dominant language in India politically as such. But the Indian National Congress, came out with a 3-language formula. Initially, Hindi was duly recognized, but then in the course of time, English also was added, and English again started receiving prominence in the 3-language policy initiated by the Indian National Congress. And then as part of nationalism, Hindi was was projected as a national language, as an official language, and we know that a large part of the Indian population tried its best to reject, the imposition of Hindi, particularly the southern and the northeast, and also in the northern part we have several states such as Gujarat, Punjab, Rajasthan, and Kashmir and Jammu, and so a large section of the Indian population does not use Hindi. So there has always been a conflicting kind of say relationship between Hindi and the non-Hindi languages or speakers of these languages in India. So I think we are unnecessarily aping the Western form of nation when we think of a national language. I personally feel that India can do away with, should do away with the idea of national language and try to look at languages from a more, say, democratic and inclusive point of view. India is not going to suffer if, if she denounces any language as a national language or official language as such. We need to be more democratic and inclusive.
Okay, sir. There is another question. Could you please suggest any approach or methodology to be adopted for balancing native language and English language?
Yeah, there isn't a particular method as such. I always have a feeling that the debate on language is essentially a political debate. So we need to understand how, so far as TOE is concerned, and so far as we are concerned, we are the teachers of English. We need to have a very radical kind of a shift in the way we design our syllabi, the way we teach English, and the way actual teaching gets transferred in the classroom. Can we have, can we really radicalize our syllabi where we can have, we need to do away with the way English has dominated the entire educational enterprise. Without doing away with English, we need to make sure that other languages are also recognized and equally respected. It has been very well documented by the UNESCO and many other international agencies that many students fail to learn primarily because they do not receive education in their own languages. This is something which really calls for a radical shift in the way languages are planned, educational decisions are taken, and the boards of studies are formed and the syllabi are designed. Can we have, say, a graduation in, say, many languages together? They can, as we do BA in English or MA in. So can we incorporate other languages also? This could be one, say, thing that we should think along. Secondly, our classroom teaching also needs to be radically changed. Can we become more democratic and inclusive in our classroom? Can we allow our teachers to use regional languages and make the students using these languages realize that they do not suffer, or they do feel cultural inwardness when a teacher teaches a language, teacher uses a language which the child also recognizes. So there is a huge gap so far as what the children in fact understand and what a teacher does in the classroom. Thirdly, we can also think of translation, which has really helped us develop an altogether new, more democratic and say refined kind of a perspective on literature and the life around us. So translation hardly has any space in our, say, syllabus. We really do not succeed in, say, creating translators from our universities and colleges. I live in Marathwada, and I really find a good translator in Marathwada, which comprises 8 districts. So are we good translators? Do we have courses in translation? Do we have diploma or certificate course in translation? I teach a course in translation studies in SRTM University, and only one student, or sometimes 2 or sometimes 4 students opt for this kind of a course. So do we really in the undergraduation, do we really develop any kind of, say, liking for translation in the students, something which really is important. And fourthly, we need to think of how um, we try our best to do away with grammar teaching, how we should try to de-standardize our languages such as Marathi. I mean, de-standardization is something which is most urgently required. Even in case of English, I'm not speaking the British English, though I teach English in the university department. So, I mean, there is no need to say promote the RP, and I don't really understand why the government of India is spending so hugely on making us teach the RP in our phonetics classes. The RP is something which is used by less than 5% of the British population, the culturally or educationally enlightened people living in Cambridge, Oxford, and London. So why are we so obsessed with the idea of language standardization, which itself is a highly undemocratic process? So do we allow our students to use their languages freely? Why are we so conscious about grammar, and why do we want them to, write and speak in the way you do? There isn't a community which really uses language in a uniform manner. Not even the British community is like that. Despite the huge investment made by the British state and BBC and print media and educational textbooks and all that, we find 95% of the British population using the non-RP English. So this kind of variability in the use of language is something which needs to be respected and admired in the classroom. We better allow our students to write in their own ways.
There is another question.
Without being, yeah.
The Chinese people, yes. The Chinese people giving priority to their Chinese language, how they become politically and economically, still how they become politically and economically strong.
Sorry, will you please repeat, Prashant?
The Chinese people are giving priority to their Chinese language.
Yeah.
Still, how they become politically and economically strong?
Yeah. It's a good question. This is something that the Indian elite have told us. We carry an impression that English is going to help us achieve economic development. However, if you look at, say, many nations such as, South Korea or Thailand or Vietnam or Japan or China, for example, all Eastern nations, you will come to know that these are the nations which have been having their educational system based on their own languages. Like Japan, we hardly find any English medium school in Japan. So they have they devised their language policy more than 140 years ago. It was 1880 that the Japanese government came out its own policy on the use and development of the Japanese language. So China also makes a peculiar case. After the Chinese revolution in 1949, the government decided to develop the Mandarin as the language of national education, and that was made the medium of education. And China now is a superpower. There is a great demand for Chinese language education in America and the West, primarily because China has emerged as economic power. We need to understand that languages are learned primarily for economic reasons. English was demanded for by the elite in the 19th century, primarily because English education promised some kind of material affluence in the 19th century. So now we long for Japanese or Chinese or French or Korean or Arabic or German languages, primarily because people think that proficiency in these languages will somehow help them gain some kind of employment abroad or in India. So languages are learned for economic reasons. If India somehow becomes economically important, significant at an international order, we find people will find people running after Hindi. So they will try to learn Hindi, as now they are trying hard to say learn Chinese. So there are so many teachers of Chinese living in the US now, primarily because the Americans want to learn this language. So yeah, China is a very good example of how mother tongue education really helps a nation to rise and develop. Amartya Sen has already pointed out that many of the Eastern nations such as China, Japan, Thailand, both the Koreas, and Vietnam, these languages, these nations recorded, 100% literacy almost. And Sen says that they could do that primarily because they are Buddhist, and they recognize the value of their own languages, and they base their own education on their languages. So making a certain language such as English, an elitist language, is something that is not going to help us. We need to devise a policy which is truly democratic, and this kind of democratization of language education will certainly make us 100% literate. So language is very closely associated with literacy and educational gain, and China, Japan, South Korea have already proven this.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Dilip Chauhan, sir, for your fruitful, delightful, comprehensive, highly informative, insightful, and enlightening session on linguistic genocide under imperialism. In fact, we thoroughly enjoyed and learned a lot about totally new concept, at least for me, linguistic genocide from your session. Thank you very much, one and all, for your active participation by logging Zoom, and those who are watching on YouTube channel and made this lecture series a grand success. Let's join together at 1 p.m. for another interesting session by a great scholar, Dr. Ankita Khanna. She will speak on social media and language learning. Let's share and grow together. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.